took a philosophy course at university. But I have this research project on yoga that started when I was a graduate student. So I did an MA in South Asian Studies, and I was kind of floored at how bad scholarship was there. So in philosophy, you're supposed to try to understand people's reasons for their conclusions, and then you try to understand the issues as what people are disagreeing about. And in Indology, people just assume their own perspective and then try to make sense of what South Asian thinkers were saying by virtue of like how they saw the world. So basically what would lead you to fail in a philosophy course was the norm in the study. It was like all the students who flunked philosophy learned Sanskrit and became an Indologist. So I was like, I had my jaw on the ground for 5 years while I was doing this. So then I went and I wrote my PhD on translating philosophy. And so I was interested in how you would do this. And one thing I discovered was basically everything that people who thought they were studying South Asian philosophy were doing was they were basically doing exactly what philosophers in the Western tradition say you should do, which is actually exactly what, ironically, bad philosophy students do, which is you should, right? And the idea is that, well, let's just try and understand everything in terms of what we believe or what we take to be true. And at the same time, I was asked to teach a course on the Yoga Sutra to students who were actually in an Ayurvedic school. I thought they were in like a yoga sutra, but it was an Ayurvedic school and they wanted to learn the Yoga Sutra. So I said, okay, but all the translations were horrible, so I had to translate it myself. So I'd already taken Sanskrit and a fair bit of like South Asian studies before, so it was an interesting project while I was working on this challenge of understanding how we would translate ideas from people long gone who we don't share anything with. The Yoga Sutra was my project of, seeing, well, how do you do this? How do you translate? And so one of the things that, I was learning a fair bit about what successful practice in translation looks like. And it has nothing to do with trying to understand things in terms of what you take to be true. But the Yoga Sutra just started speaking to me. It just started answering all sorts of questions I had about how you go about life as a reasonable person. And so it wasn't entirely new to me. So I'd grown up in a home where these ideas of yoga were in the background, and I'd studied Indian philosophy before, but really at this point, I really started studying the Yoga Sutra. And so life started changing for me in all sorts of ways. And it started to change for the better. The more I understood what the Yoga Sutra was offering, the more I was able to free myself from all sorts of baggage and hangups that I didn't quite appreciate I had, right? That I thought I needed, but I didn't. So what I'm going to do, I guess, is I'm going to start with a kind of general overview of where yoga fits in, the philosophy fits in the realm of the options, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about yoga, and then I'll try and connect it to the yamas and niyamas. I know Leanne's been doing a great job of stressing the importance of these two very important limbs of yoga, so I'm going to try and end up there. So hopefully then this won't seem like it's completely out of touch with what you've been talking about. So, all right, so the options. So one of the things that I thought was really weird when I was trying to learn from scholars of South Asia, who I even at the time I thought they were out to lunch, but now I'm quite sure that they were, was there was this dogma that said that these Indian thinkers, they talked about everything except for basic ethical questions of like how to live your life, right? That somehow they had a view on everything about how you can know and what reality is, but they had no view on practical matters, which just floored me because everything I knew about this tradition was all about practical issues. And if you're interested in yoga, it's all about practice, right? So clearly there's something mistaken about that. And so like I said, one problem was that they were trying to understand everything in terms of how they saw the world. And so they were bringing to the challenge of understanding Indian philosophy and yoga their preconceptions. But the other problem was they weren't thinking about ethical issues in terms of what we can disagree about, right? And I guess it's kind of natural. Everybody kind of likes their view of the world. But when you are a student, you have to understand what the options are. And to understand the options, then you can't simply be like how you see things, right? You have to think about it in terms of things we can disagree about. And then once you frame the issue in terms of the possibilities of disagreement, you're then free to choose what seems appealing from the options. So ethical issues are basically, they're boiled down to disagreement about the right choice or the good outcome. So every ethical theory is going to have something to say about the relationship between choosing and doing on the one hand, and the kinds of things that we should be aiming for. And there's three famous theories in the Western tradition, and then yoga is a fourth basic ethical theory for which you won't find anything obviously corresponding in the Western tradition. So the most famous probably theory that people are aware of is virtue ethics. So virtue ethics says that you have to figure out what to do, you have to find a good person, because the right thing to do is just whatever they choose. Right? So it's a very influential theory. Plato and Aristotle. It underwrites theism, right? So God is the ultimately virtuous agent, and for a theist, you can't know what to do if you don't know who God is, because otherwise, who's going to tell you, right? So that's a very it's a very ancient view. Then there's another view, consequentialism, which says that, well, you have to figure out what to aim for, right? So what the good things of life are, and then you just choose to do something that gets you there. And yoga is often mistakenly thought to be a version of this, but it's not. But so the consequentialists might say that happiness is a good thing that you should be aiming for. And so then you should just choose whatever increases happiness for yourself or other people. In the South Asian tradition, there are lots of versions of this. Buddhists are kind of consequentialists. They think that suffering is something you should minimize. And so you should be doing things that bring about this minimization of suffering. So that's two theories, virtue ethics, consequentialism. Then there's a theory called deontology that says that there are lots of good things to do, but you should only do the reasonable things, right? So, as a professor, it would be good for me to give everybody an A because it would make everybody happy, right? So that's a good thing I can do, but it wouldn't be the right thing for me to do for a number of reasons, right? First of all, I would be ignoring the people who had actually kind of worked and earned an A. I would also be diluting the meaning of an A if it was simply something that I gave to everybody that just registered for the course, right? So I would actually be diminishing the importance of that grade. So a deontologist would say, well, while there are many good things you can do, and some of them include, say, making people happy, right? You should really only do the things that you have reason to do, that, on inspection. And then they'll specify, every deontologist will have some story about what kinds of considerations are relevant. Okay, so deontologists tend to emphasize rules and duties and rights. And they think that, it's really important for you to stick to these things regardless of the further consequences that might arise. Okay, so those are the three really big options in the Western tradition. Now, yoga is kind of the opposite of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics says, find goodness first, and then what follows from that is the right choice. Yoga is the idea that, well, you have to figure out what's right first, and then as you start to perfect the right, goodness comes out of it. Okay, so that's why practice is so important for the yogi. Now, the right thing to do in the yoga tradition is to act in a devotional practice, and what you're devoted to is the ideal of persons, which is, the Sanskrit is Ishvara. It's often translated as the Lord. I think lordliness is probably a better way of grasping it, but there are two essential characteristics of lordliness. On the one hand, this kind of abstract ideal of what it is to be a person is not constrained by the consequences of past actions, so it's unconservative. And it's also not afflicted. That is, its choices are a matter of its own doing. It's not a matter of external influence. So it's self-governing. So lordliness is about being both unconservative and self-governing. So when you are practicing yoga, what you're doing is you're engaging in the practice of devotion to this ideal. And the idea is then that the ideal isn't good, it's right. It's about how to choose. It's not about a specific outcome, but as you continue with the practice, this devotional practice, what ends up happening is the quality of your own performance and behavior starts to change, so that you start to display these characteristics of lordliness yourself, right? So, I like musical analogies are kind of useful because it's music is or athletic, but I'll start with the musical. So, when you're learning how to play music, you have to envision this. You have to grasp in some abstract sense the ideal of music, and then you start a practice. And at first you're bad, right? You are really bad. But what makes the practice worthwhile isn't the goodness or badness of the goodness of the practice, because it's not good. It's lousy when you're first starting. What makes the practice worthwhile is that you're engaged in a devotion to this ideal of music. And then what happens over time as you stick with the practice is that your own performance starts to change, so that you start to make music. So this ideal that you first were devoted to becomes something that you start displaying in your own activity, right? And the difference between stellar musicians and those of us who are less good is the proximity, is how far we are on this journey of devotion, right? Because there's no end, right? So even when you're like John Coltrane or someone remarkable, these people are remarkable because they're always judging their action in terms of devotion to the ideal. So it gives them an opportunity to assess their performance, to revise their own expectations of themselves, right? So, when you're engaged in this devotional practice, it's not like there are a bunch of rules that you stick with forever. There are like rules for a certain stage. And then once you've mastered that, you move on. And then all of a sudden you have a new set of challenges. And the old rules that you were trying to conform to, they're like training wheels. You don't use or need them anymore. So at every stage, devotion to lordliness or the ideal of a practice opens up a whole new set of challenges. So it's not like you get someplace and you're done. But at the same time, the point of the exercise isn't to achieve anything, right? It's that the point of the exercise is to engage in that devotion. So one of the reasons why I think yoga is so interesting is that it helps us understand why people don't succeed, right? So the easiest way not to succeed is to think about the point of action in terms of some outcome or end, right? And then the more special the outcome or the end, the less likely it is that you're going to be successful, just statistically, right? But then if it's unlikely that you're going to be successful, and if the whole point of activity is to get to that end state, right, then it seems like your activity is pointless because the chances are that you're going to fail. So what I'm describing right now is how life looks like when you adopt consequentialism, this idea that there are these good things that you should be aiming to produce, and then you just choose whatever gets you there, with exceptional expectations, right? So if your expectations are pretty low and the goal that you want to achieve is very easy to achieve, then being a consequentialist who chooses an action just for that and isn't going to depress you or make you quit. But the moment you start raising your expectations to something more important and less likely, just statistically likely, it's less accomplished, it's less of what you see normally, statistically, the chances of your success start to go down, right? Like, say I want to be an astronaut. How many people are going to be an astronaut, right? If I was a kid and I had that ambition, it would be so unlikely. Or, even being a philosophy professor, I just remember people saying, oh, you won't make it. People don't succeed in that. There are very few jobs and blah, 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 blah. Now, if you think in those terms, if you think that you should be, right, choosing so as to get someplace, then the unlikelihood of that end state starts counting against your effort. And so what ends up happening is that you simply won't strive for anything exceptional. But if you're a yogi, right, you're not worried about getting to some exceptional state of accomplishment. You see value in your activity insofar as it's a devotion to this ideal of practice. So whereas someone who thinks consequently would just give up because success is unlikely, right? The yogi doesn't, but that's because she's not really worried about accomplishing that. She's worried about her practice now and her devotion to the ideal of that practice now, right? So if you adopt yoga, you'll stick to something long enough to actually produce results, but you'll do it because you were never really worried about the results in the first place as your motivation to do anything, right? So yoga then, I think, so when I started appreciating this, it was a bit, I mean, I look back on the difficult times in my life when I was really upset, or I had a lot of problems motivating myself to pick up and move on, right? I realized retrospectively that I was thinking consequently, in a kind of this consequential manner, because I was thinking about the value of my activity in terms of some type of external standard of success that you're never going to have when you're midway through a project, right? Or when you're starting out something, right? That success comes a lot later. But if you're constantly expecting those standards to be what you're measuring your work by, right, you're going to be upset all the time, right? And in fact, nothing is going to be worth doing because the standards of success can be extremely high, and you could always be a failure by them, right? So life becomes this unlivable event when you start to think this way. And all of a sudden, if you can become a yogi, then all of a sudden it's simplified, and it's something that you can succeed at, because you're no longer judging the value or the success of what you're doing in terms of some external standard. It's about your devotion to the ideal of the practice. Okay, so for me, I mean, I think I look at my friends who, I look at people in general who are having a lot of difficulty with the lockdown. Now, there are real difficulties that people are going through with unemployment, etc. But then there's also just kind of the anxiety of like not living your life in terms of some expectation of what you thought that would look like, right? And I find a lot of people are wasting their time ruminating about this. And I'm like, why am I not ruminating about this? Oh yeah, because I'm practicing yoga, right? So I'm not actually judging what I'm doing now by some image of how my life is supposed to look like, right? I'm judging it in terms of my devotion every day to the ideal of my practice. And so in a way, nothing's changed, right? Now I'm fortunate, right? It's not like I'm unemployed and I'm out on the street, etc. But it is interesting that if you can switch your way of thinking to yoga, right? Any difficult circumstance that you're in is going to not be evidence towards your failure, right? Because you're not going to judge the outcomes as a standard by which you evaluate the importance of your activity, right? So you're less likely to get depressed or discouraged by life challenges when you adopt yoga, because you don't count those challenges or outcomes as a standard by which you judge your activity, right? So it's not that you won't have problems and there won't be difficulties, but you don't treat those as evidence about the meaningfulness of your activity, right? That those outcomes don't play a role in your own evaluation of the importance of your life, right? So I think this is a gift you can give yourself, right? This is just something you can do for yourself. You can just switch to evaluating your activity that way. It's not like the problems just disappear, but how you relate to those problems radically change. So they stop being an obstacle to your success, and just they start becoming a kind of momentary, the scenery on the way, right? All the difficulties end up being that way too. And of course, the greater the difficulties, the harder it is to really switch. It tests, but at the same time, if you were to give in and let the difficulties be a standard of your activities, then you're just going to you'll just give in and give up, right? Especially when things get more difficult. So it's almost as though the more difficulties that you're facing, the more reason you have to just switch to thinking in terms of yoga. Okay, so so that's kind of the core of the theory. So I want to say a couple of things, and then I'll get to the yamas and the niyamas. So one thing that this theory about action teaches us is that what it is to be a person is to be the kind of thing with an interest in its own lordliness. So people aren't just, say, human beings, right? So people are the kinds of things that thrive given the opportunity to exercise their own lordliness. So not only non-human animals, but the earth, right? So people in this tradition just saw people everywhere, right? In the Western tradition, people is this word you use for human. It's like it's interchangeable. And there are historical reasons for that. But I think that when you start switching to thinking about yoga and you start thinking about what it is to be a person, right? It's not the same as how you look or what you sound like, right? It's really about what explains the quality of your life, right? And so this is then, I think, I mean, a lot of times yoga in the West, this part of the tradition can be difficult for some people to accept because they feel like it forces them to really reevaluate all sorts of life decisions like grocery shopping and like what they buy, etc. But I think on the upside, one of the things that you learn is how much you have in common with so many other beings and critters and people, right? So one of the, even with respect to other humans, if we don't see things yogically, we don't appreciate in what way we have something in common, right? So we look for superficial similarities like the accent people speak in, or the language they speak, or the kinds of foods that they eat, etc. But when we switch to yoga, we start to see that really what we have in common is an interest in our own lordliness. So this is something that we share. And moreover, because lordliness is about us kind of transcending our challenges and really being in charge of our own life, we all have an interest in supporting a world that makes it possible for people to do this kind of thing, right? So we actually have that in common. So when you don't think yogically, it's really easy to think about life as a kind of zero-sum game. So when one person succeeds, that means there's less success for me, right? And everybody seems like you view everybody suspiciously as like a competitor, right? But when you start to see that we all have this common interest in lordliness, then there's a way that you can get along with other people so that your choices are not only good for you, but they're good for others too, right? So all of a sudden that competitive element of life gets removed out of the picture, right? It's not that you don't necessarily have these kinds of, you might have this baggage of feelings of like suspicion or worry about other people, and what does it mean when these things are happening for them. But I think one of the interesting things about yoga is that you yourself start evaluating your life so differently. So just as you don't judge your own life in terms of external standards, right? What's going on with other people also stops being anything that you use as a standard of your life, because that's just another kind of external standard. And you start switching to making choices that are really good for you and everyone else. So I think that one of the nice outcomes of yoga is that it actually allows you to reduce friction between you and other people, because you don't understand your success in any way that undermines other people's possibilities to live successfully too, right? They might view you that way, but you don't view them that way. So what that helps you do is make choices that really help you thrive and make it possible for others to do so too, right? So that's a kind of that's a plus, I think. Um, because so often we're raised to think that somehow success is, there's just so many cookies in the jar, and success means you get the most number of cookies or something like that, right? But that's how you would think if you were judging success in terms of external standards, right? The cookie count. Okay. So that seems to me to be a plus. But the flip side of that is that we need to take action. And now I'm coming to the yamas. We need to take action so that there's room for us to practice yoga. And so this is where the yamas come in. So the yamas are, even before you get around to the nitty-gritties of practicing yoga, right, you have to think about activity and choices that disrupt harm. So one of the things I noticed was I was looking at this part of the Yoga Sutra, and I was noticing that potentially it was basically advocating nonviolent civil disobedience in the face of tyranny. And then I contacted a Gandhi scholar and I told her about this. And then she went off and wrote a whole book about how Gandhi, who famously used this tactic to drive away the British, and then inspired Martin Luther King to engage in the same kind of struggle, civil rights movement. Gandhi had referenced potentially left, right, and center, the Yoga Sutra, left, right, and center in his works, and credited the Yoga Sutra with the origins of his political doctrine, right? This idea that, when you live in a world that isn't really interested in making room for people to thrive, right? You have to engage in a struggle or a fight to disrupt that, but you do that by creating an environment that's safe, right? So what you have to do then is you have to find a way to disrupt the harm. And so then you start thinking kind of strategically in that way. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to live a life that's not harmful for you and other people. So at first it seems like, like a threat to them, right? When like Rosa Parks sits in a part of the bus where people are like, why are you sitting there? And they get upset, right? Like first they're upset, but then after a while you realize she's just sitting on a bus, right? So so this is what life for the yogi is like, right? And potentially appreciated this, 2,000 years ago. And so the yamas then are really about political engagement that allows you to make room for you to practice. But in order to do that, you have to be engaged in making sure that the world you live in is safe for you to practice. So yoga isn't about kind of running away to an ashram or, just something you do on retreats, right? It's like, it's everyday life, and it is political. But the idea is then that when we disrupt harm, ahimsa, there are a set of facts, that's satya, that's the next yama, truth. And these set of facts reveal asteya, non-stealing, other people with what they need, right? So they haven't been deprived of what they require. Brahmachari, that means two things. It means studentship, but it also means respecting personal boundaries. So we're then in a position to learn something about other people and respect their boundaries. And then finally, aparigraha, we haven't hoarded, right? So hoarding, so it's a funny thing to tack on the end, but I think it's just another way of saying that you're not judging your activity by these external standards, right? So it's not like once you've done this, all of a sudden you've ended up with a whole bunch of more stuff, right? The idea is that what you've done is you've made room for yourself and other people to be people in a world where you can practice yoga. Okay, so that's, I think, really what the yamas are about. So the order, I think, is really important. You have to start with ahimsa, or non-harm. Now, non-harm, a lot of times people think this means that it's a rule, don't do anything harmful. It's not a rule, because if it was that, you would never be able to disrupt harmful processes, right? Because you would be harming it. It's rather an ideal, right? Something that you have to be devoted to, which means then that you have to do things to disrupt harm. in your environment. So that does mean taking a stand. That does mean putting yourself out there, but you know that you're successful when you find a world where other people's boundaries are left intact, right? So that's your standard of success, you and a bunch of other people. So in a way, it's easy, but you do generally have to put up with other people's emotional baggage for a bit. Potentially, he talks about this in the Yoga Sutra, because at first there'll be resistance, but because what you're doing is actually based in non-harmfulness, other people stop being so threatened, right? Because they see that you're actually not a threat. So even though they might at first see that or believe that, they don't end up that way. So that is a kind of hallmark of this type of activism, right? It's not about making enemies. It's about it's about making people not your enemy by showing them that there's just another way that we can live together. That's good for us all. So that's where the yamas are. And then after you have started the yamas, so one of the things about the limbs of yoga is they're not like steps. You're actually just adding layers onto your practice. So it's not like you ever stop having to engage in the yamas. But once you've started that, you can then go on to the niyamas. So the niyamas are personal observances as a practitioner of yoga. So these personal observances contain the 3 essential practices of yoga. So at the start of book 2, the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali teaches us that there are 3 practices of yoga. One is devotion to Ishvara Pranidhana, Lordliness. But then he doesn't talk about Ishvara. What he does is he splits up the 2 essential traits of Ishvara into 2 further practices. So Ishvara is defined by not being conservative and also being self-governing. And so Patanjali then says you have to practice these 2 things. So you have to practice tapas. To practice tapas is to push against restrictive boundaries, to break old habits, to not be stuck in old ways. And then swadhyaya. Now swadhyaya literally means self-study, but in the yoga account, if you're going to understand something, you have to take charge of what you're trying to understand. That goes to the beginning of book 1. This is about just taking responsibility for your life. But if you're studying yourself, then that means you're taking charge of yourself, right? So swadhyaya is really about self-governance. So at the start of book 2, Patanjali lists these 3 basic practices. So I think one of the interesting things about yogic action is that it's always this attempt to mediate between tapas or on conservatism, pushing your own boundaries, but also swadhyaya or self-governance, right? So how do people hurt themselves when they're like at the gym or doing yoga? It's like they just do tapas, right? They just try to push boundaries without also trying to maintain a connection to themselves, right? As people governing their activities. And so you're supposed to be including both of these in your activities as a practitioner. So these are these 3 practices he lists at the start of book 2, and these show up in the niyamas as personal observances. And then he adds 2 more observances. One is santosh, which is contentment with the practice. So if you're not content with the practice, you're going to stop practicing. So you have to find a way to be happy with that. And then the other is saucha, which is purity. So this is often interpreted as like just physical hygiene, and it's that, but it's also being against anti-yogic things, right? So you're trying to push yourself. So that's an important part of yoga, right? Moving past your old constraints as you transform. And so to support this, then you also have to be kind of against things that aren't going to be helpful to you. So those then are the 2 of 8 beginning limbs, but they're really important limbs because the first one is what you need in order to make space in your world for you to practice. And the second one describes what that practice is going to look like for you, right? And then the subsequent limbs kind of tease out features of kind of further layers and intensity of practice. But those are two really good places to stay for a long time, because in a way, right, I think one of the nice things about yoga is that you're not trying to go someplace else. There's no place you're trying to get to. It's about living more richly in your life. So these two limbs then really flush out what that's going to look like as a dynamic process, right? It's not like a one-time thing. It's this constant thing. You're constantly making room for yourself in your world, for people to practice, and you're constantly observing these three basic practical ideals of practice as you are content with your practice and you are against anti-yogic things. Okay, so I got to the yamas and niyamas, so I'm going to stop talking now.
So I have a question. One of the things that we hear a lot, we're in the South, and it is very religious down here.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people, I think, try to assimilate yoga and their beliefs. And you talked a little bit about that. But can you define, when you talk about lordliness, define lordliness?
Right. So it's an abstract idea, but potentially also says it's a person. But that's because to be a person is to be a kind of abstraction from your life, right? You're not the same as any of your experiences. You're not the same as your body, it changes, or your mind, right? You are that abstraction you need to call upon when you are evaluating how you're living, right? So there's a you that you need to come to terms with when you're making these kind of basic choices about what to take seriously, what to give priority to, right? And that you is an abstraction. It isn't the same as what you ate for lunch or even necessarily what you're doing at the time of that evaluation, but it's the you that you need to kind of come to terms with as you get serious about living. Okay. So each one of us is in a way an abstraction. And I think that's why in this yoga tradition, no one ever thought that physical death is really the end of a person, because that was never really totally you anyways, right? So insofar as you are that thing that has an interest in your own lordliness, right, that's forever. So I think there's a kind of overlap with religion in your parts of the world, and that's that. So it's not always the case that they're absolutely unrelated to each other. There's that kind of similarity. I think that if you're serious about yoga, you can have connections to people who are gone, connections to people who are yet to be born, and that's because these connections are all abstract. Now, Ishvara, the Lord, is kind of a higher order abstraction, but still a person, because a person's the kind of thing that has an interest in their own lordliness, and the Lord would be that kind of thing, right? And so potentially defines it in terms of these two essential traits: not being stuck in the past, kind of free from the past, right? So not stuck in a rut, not having to live according to past decisions, right? Free to make new decisions. And then also self-governing. So the funny thing, though, is that potentially he talks about that in book 1, and then when he moves to book 2, he stops talking to the Lord, and then he just divides up these two traits into these two further practices. But I think that's because an important part of yoga is about getting rid of these external standards, right? So if you were to think about God as a kind of external standard that sits in judgment, right, you're always a failure, and then what's the point, right? But if you have a way to personalize these ideals as something that guides your own choices and activity, you have a way to keep Ishvara as part of your practice. Now, I think the yoga idea of the Lord isn't the same as a theistic idea of God, because a theistic idea of God is good, right? It's a thing it's an outcome of the world, of reality that we have to listen to in order to understand how to live our life. The Lord is not that, because really, if we're devoted to the Lord, we take on the responsibility of figuring that out for ourselves. Now, that having been said, people in this tradition are very serious about worship and devotion. And so there are lots of, a lot of my colleagues get interested, you know, if you find out about their biographies, right, they're interested in this tradition because it sounds, there's a lot of resonance with Christianity. One of my senior colleagues is a Jesuit priest at Harvard. He's a very accomplished scholar of yoga and Vaishnava traditions that are associated with yoga. And he himself is a practicing Catholic. He's a priest, right? But for him, he's interested in this because he sees these connections. And you know, there are aspects of these traditions that are open. So you know, I don't know about every kind of Christianity, but I do know that at least I think this is what allows him to draw these connections, is that there is this idea. I think this was actually decided in one of the councils, that like, even though being a good Christian is about, say, reading the Bible and all of this, that other people can still find their way and God still likes them, right? So there is this aspect to some Christian traditions that are kind of open to the possibility of people finding their own way, right? And so I think that, you know, in that respect, you can maybe have a certain kind of sympathy for what's going on. I think the real issue is going to be what is it that you are expecting from God, right? And one of the things about Ishvara is that you can expect very little, unless you're devoted. But then what you're doing is you're taking on that practice of devotion for yourself. You're taking responsibility for that, and that transforms you. So you still have a story to tell about your life where Ishvara made a difference, where lordliness or God made a difference, if you want to use the God word, right? But it's not one that's that you can tell without the choices that you made and what you did, right? So you can't, you know, it's not just a just so, and then I started believing and everything changed, right? It's not that at all. It's that I decided to take on this practice of being devoted, and this ideal is part of my practice. It's real, but that story then is something that involves you too. So I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. Like, I mean, all I know is what I get from the media and the news in terms of like Southern Christianity and its kind of right. Its evangelical flavor. So I'm not entirely sure who exactly you're hanging out with or what's going on. But I'd imagine that there are versions of Christianity that would be very difficult to square with this. And then there would be versions where it would be pretty easy. But really, I think the issue is, what is it that you're expecting?
And that's, I think, I came from California and then had moved around the East Coast and all over. But coming here and opening a studio, there's some people that think we're drinking Kool-Aid and burning witches or something in the studio. You know, the standard kind of definition a lot of people give is that yoga takes you closer to whatever it is you believe.
Yeah, not true.
Okay. For
the following reason, that engaging in yoga is about getting rid of belief as a way of relating to reality. So this is in book 1. So Patanjali begins with this choice. It says, well, either you can relate to reality in terms of your attitudes, like your beliefs or your fears or your hopes, or you could take responsibility for organizing the data of your experience. So the problem is, when we relate to life in terms of what we believe, that ends up actually being a kind of prison for us, because it starts limiting the kinds of choices that we're willing to consider. But if we take responsibility for what we're thinking about, right, then we can engage with the same ideas, but now we're in charge. Okay, so I think that's why it's really important for Patanjali to change everything into practice, right? It's not like you just sit around and like just memorize something. It has to become something you're doing, because that gives you the power back, right? And if you simply think about it in terms of beliefs, it limits you, because then you're stuck with this attitude. Like the analogy I give my students is, if I believe it's raining outside, I'm not going to go look out the window to check, because I've already decided it's true, right? But if you tell me, if we just consider the proposition it's raining outside, but we're not believing or fearing it, or it's just a thought, then we're in a position to go investigate, right? And so yoga is about treating life in the latter and not the former way. So if people are using yoga as a kind of instrumental prop for their beliefs, I think they're not engaging in yoga. They're doing something else. That's like a neighbor to yoga. So yeah.
Yeah. What else? Do people have questions? If so, you can unmute yourself and ask.
I have this effect on people. Was it something I said?
I bet people have questions.
I mean, I could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I think one of the things that I think is nice that people who come from these other traditions, or at least they're willing to like invite yoga that much into their life, right? They're not really willing to engage in kind of unbelieving and just thinking about the things that they've been taught, right? But at least they're willing to, you know, try something new. So I would like to encourage people, you know, because that's kind of yogic too, right? A certain openness to something new, not to be scared and limited by your past experiences. I think those are all kind of positive things that yoga really tries to encourage in us.
So we have, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
So Dawn actually was in teacher training, and they have a Seva project where they go out and they share yoga in the community. Some people do different organizations, and she had an experience where she pretty much was attacked
Oh,
by,
really?
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I was going to offer, me and some fellow students, we're going to offer free yoga to the recovery group that was held through a church.
Okay.
And in order to get permission for that, I had to meet with a religious council, which included this church and several other church of a couple of different religions. And I showed up at Panera for lunch, and they were immediately jumped on me that it was the work of Satan, that I was promoting Hinduism, that we would be, you know, that unless I quoted the Bible while teaching, then we couldn't do this. And I mean, I was just attacked.
So sorry to hear that. Yeah. That's horrible. Yeah.
And then it was funny because one of the pastors spoke up after about 20 minutes of me getting lambasted. He spoke up and said, "Just so you know, I practice yoga every day."
Really?
And I don't think that's what happens, and it's not really tied to any religion. It was my understanding, and he spoke up. They still didn't let me do it, but
right. And he waited 20 minutes. That's a little sad. Yeah. So, I mean, I have a lot to say about this. I think that what you're looking at, there are layers of okay, I'm going to give you a little history lesson, and then once I've given the little history lesson, it'll make sense of what I have to say. So, our idea of religion actually goes back to the Romans. The Romans had this category religio for groups that they would tolerate, that weren't necessarily. Some of them were kind of Romanish, but like say the Jews were allowed. They had religio. And they were different from groups that had superstitione, so religion versus superstition. And so superstition was bad. Religio was tolerated. It was some kind of tradition that was allowed. And that's where we get our idea of religion from. But if you really want to understand how we got to this idea in the first place, you have to go back to the Greeks. So the Greeks had one word for thought, language, and reason, which is logos. So reasoning or thinking is about what you can say. So in this tradition, then, thinking isn't really any different from what you or your group is willing to endorse. So what happens, and that's just the same as reason. They have one word for all of this, right? So what happens when this tradition starts to go out and starts to expand is that over time, it ends up defining anything without roots in this intellectual tradition as religion, which is why all world religions are non-European, right? And even if you were to think about the ones that could have been religious, like say Norse mythology or something, it's not actually rooted in the Greeks. And the stuff that the Greeks talk about, that's literature. Homer. You don't read about Homer. If you want to study Greek mythology, it's just literature. So it's a funny tradition, but it took over the world. So what happens is that as it starts to grow, it starts to categorize non-European traditions without a root in ancient Greek as religious. And so, but sometimes traditions wanted this because it was a way to be tolerated. So early Christians were treated as having superstitione, not religio, and they were persecuted. And so they had to make the case that they were just a different kind of Jew, which ended up being the official story, right? That the New Testament is just a kind of addition to the Old Testament. But that's the way they stopped being fed to the lions in Rome. So the Western tradition created this environment where it became people's interest to register. So what ends up happening is it starts to expand. So Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam, those are kind of early, they embrace this category as a matter of self-understanding. But then as this tradition starts to expand further east, you have people who aren't part of this weird Greco-Roman thing. But as the Western tradition starts to expand, they just start talking about everybody as having a religion. It's just whatever it is that you're doing around here. So when the British take over South Asia, they decide they need a word for all indigenous South Asian religion, and they choose Hinduism. So Hindu is probably Persian. So the Persians would talk about Indians as Hindus because it's just a geographic description. And so when the British come to power, they decide that if you're not a Muslim, you're a Hindu. So then overnight, you have this religious identity born. And like I was born thinking I was religious, I was a Hindu. And then like I started doing this research, and then I realized people had already kind of talked about the spread of religious identity and the relationship between that and colonialism. But nobody had pointed out how or why this came about. And it has to do with this really bizarre Greek idea of thought as what you can say. Because if you believe that, then outsiders become very difficult to make sense of. And so everything they believe is mysterious and kind of weird, right? So all those stereotypical things we think about religion come from this inability of this bizarre model of thought to understand the outsider. So now fast forward to what are called conservative areas, right? So so it's not just in the southern U.S. India's going through this problem too, because people now believe they're Hindus, which is just like, it blows my mind. That's a category that your colonial master gave to you, right? But what ends up happening then is that people, they end up embracing this old Greek idea of thinking as just, well, whatever it is that we believe, which then makes it difficult to understand outsiders. So outsiders become this kind of threatening, because you can't make sense of them. And moreover, they threaten the cultural uniformity that you think is thinking. So one of these really weird things that I observe, and it's difficult to articulate without the history lesson, but what you're seeing, what you experience, that's just one very powerful consequence of Western imperialism. That we have this very bizarre tradition that has difficulty making sense of philosophical possibilities, identifies thinking with culture, whatever the group is doing, and then problematizes people who aren't part of that. Religion is just like, so now we have race, so race comes later, but religion is basically the same idea, but like for ideas, right? So, just as there's a kind of, and as you go further away from being white, you're racialized, right? And all of a sudden racial categories become an important part of your social experience in North America, right? The same is true with ideas. The farther away your ideas are from the philosophical tradition rooted in Greece, the more religious they are. But that's just branding, right? It's just, there's nothing to it. So, you know, I think the only thing you can do with these folks is that you have to practice more yoga, right? So you have to find a way to show them that what you're doing is not threatening. You're not there to tell them what to believe, right? Because yogis aren't interested in that anyways. And if you can show that to them, right, then I think their sense of having their, you know, their radar go up, they'll feel a little less put off. That's not easy to do because they're just like so on edge, but it's something that, you know, as practitioners we can do, right? We can say, look, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. That's not what I'm interested in, right? And then if they get really serious, you can start having these kinds of conversations like the ones that we were having. But
one of my
my
teachers,
2 cents.
Tim Miller, used to say he loved that the practice of yoga, like you didn't have to convince anyone of anything because the benefits were irrefutable. So
Right.
there's nothing to convince anybody of. You just have them practice and then come to their own conclusions. I think it's a big responsibility to tell somebody what to believe or not believe. For
sure. You don't want that problem anyways, right? Because then they become your problem, right? You're not trying to convince anybody of anything. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Anybody have any other questions?
I was just curious because based on what you're saying about, you know, Hinduism was like a region, Hindu, like the region, and then the colonialism brought it over and named it. Would that mean that essentially, because I think in my life I've thought yoga was like from Hinduism, but is that not the case?
Well, it is in this very superficial sense that anything South Asian is, so Hindu, the way the British employed it means something like South Asian, no common founder. So anything South Asian can be Hindu. So I explain it this way. The category of Hinduism is like fruit salad. So fruit salad is a collection of different pieces of fruit. It doesn't follow from that a piece of fruit salad is also a collection of different pieces of fruit, right? Like you can extricate a piece of apple. That's just a piece of apple. You put it back in the collection fruit salad. So Hinduism is like that. It describes the collection. It doesn't describe the constituents. So in this very empty set, so I don't know where I put it. Anyways, my recent book, I didn't want to write about this, but I ended up writing about it. Oh, here it is. In part, I didn't want to write about it because I thought nobody really would want to read anything about it. But anyways, it's called Hinduism, A Contemporary Philosophical Investigation. It's by the academic publisher Routledge. And so one of the things I point out is that if you understand the historical context in which the name Hinduism comes about, what that does is allows you to name a set of options. And the other interesting thing you'll discover is that the only thing they had in common was that they were just the open-ended disagreements of philosophy. So every option is on the table in this tradition, right? It's not like they all believed in X, right? They just disagreed about everything. However, one of the things I do point out is that if you want to understand how these people were able to historically get along without actually agreeing on anything, it was the values of yoga that made that possible. Because the values of yoga really are about our own, allowing everybody to be themselves as individuals, quirky individuals. And so there's no need for us to share beliefs or perspective, and we can disagree. So I do think that there is an important connection between what we think of as Hinduism and yoga, but in the way that like there's a connection between pieces of apple and like fruit salad, right? So if you want to just talk about yoga on its own, you don't need to bring up Hinduism. If people are really insistent on using religious categories, it's just true by definition, but it's such an empty, I mean, I think people think, because say Christianity or Judaism or Islam, they're not like fruit salad, right? They're not class categories, they're kind categories. So So Christianity has to do with, the identification of Jesus as God. And so anything that's Christian is going to exemplify this group trait, right? So when people think about Hinduism, they're expecting some kind of common trait amongst the Hindu things. So I think that makes Hindu things seem more threatening than they need to be, right? Because it seems like if I'm going to take something from Hinduism seriously, then I can't take my Christianity seriously. Meanwhile, it's just a bunch of disagreeing options. So sure, why not, right? There's no requirement for you to give up whatever it is that you believe in order to consider these options. So I think when people understand what it historically is, it should be less threatening. But there are ripples of it. Like, I'm sure that you're all aware of those legal challenges for teaching yoga in schools in California. And the courts decided that it was okay. It passed this lemon test. There's this legal test called the lemon test. And so while they acknowledge that yoga does stem from Hinduism, teaching yoga doesn't involve the kind of promotion of any particular religion to the detriment of another, right? Which is just true, right? Like right? Because it's not about what you believe. Go home and believe whatever you want, right? We're not, as practitioners, we're not trying to take over that part of your life.
And the irony is we were able to teach yoga in Middle Tennessee to schools.
Oh, really?
Without issues.
Well, there was just a family, I think, who had money, right? You need a family with money that's going to be willing to spend it on a court case, right? So probably California, I'd imagine. Some rich people in LA. I think I forget where they were, but anyways.
Encinitas.
Oh, were they? Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
Does that fit with my story? Is that a well-off area?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So yeah. So I think, one of the things that I like about yoga is that when you start doing it, you have to start kind of asking these weird questions about like why are people so fussed about X, Y, and Z? Is this a religion? Does that matter? And then you start to realize that there are these stories that we've just been taught to believe. Like there's this thing, Hinduism, right? And that if you do this, you're becoming a Hindu, right? Meanwhile, that was just a bureaucratic decision and it means nothing, right? But this is what would happen as you practice, right? You start working on your own lordliness, so you stop being constrained by prejudices and common myths, and then I think the idea is that you start to understand the origins of other people's aversion, right? So they say it's because they're a Christian. That's not the problem. The problem is that they are engaging with things by way of their beliefs and fears, which makes contemplating alternatives very difficult, right? If I can only understand what I believe, then if you present me with the logical opposite, then I have to believe a contradiction, and that's called cognitive dissonance. It's a very difficult state to be in, to believe like it's both night and day at the same time, or that I'm at once a square and a circle or something. It's difficult. And it's a frustrating experience. So people who are tied to this non-yogic way of life, where they understand everything by way of their beliefs and fears, they have difficulties with novelty, right? Because they've set up a system that makes contemplating that very difficult. So, but once you understand that's a problem, right, you can help them know that you're not out to convert them, right? You're not really there to. So they're telling you, so this is a very important life lesson for you. It's taken me a long time, that as you get serious about the practice of yoga, you can't take other people's fuss at face value. They say they're upset about one thing, but really something else is going on, right? And as a practitioner, you start kind of twigging on to what that is. It's a failure to be yogic. It's not whatever it is that they're saying. That's rarely ever true or insightful.
So good. Thank you so much, Shyam, for coming and talking to us. Oh,
you're most welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
So can you tell us, because we'll turn this into a podcast as well, how can people keep in touch with you?
Oh, great. Thanks. So, yogaphilosophy.com. That's my website. So if you go there, you can sign up for our email list. So I send out short yoga philosophy teaching content that you could use. So then you're on the list. You can contact me directly once you're on the list. You can follow me on Instagram, yogaphilosophy_com. Those are 2 ways. And then from yogaphilosophy.com, there are courses that I am offering, but before you worry about courses, just get the free stuff and we could start talking.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you so much.
appreciate
Take
it.
care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Thank you.